So we made a trip to the greenhouse to get some pops of color for the front bed and that guy, a replacement coleus for one of the planters that didn't make it. And while we were there, oh, ferns and hosta for the north bed.
This is the north bed, and this bed was not working, or at least thought it wasn't working. This is an awkward little dirt strip on the north side of the house, and for years the main thing that it seemed willing to grow successfully was creeping bellflower, also known around here as zombie weed. And the trouble is, this bed is visible from the street. My neighbors across the road can see it. So every time it looked like an abandoned city lot, it was not just a private shame, it was public performance. So years ago, I came up with what seemed like a very practical plan. Peonies. Big, bushy, dependable peonies. I thought, perfect. I'll plant a bunch of peonies in here. They'll grow into great, big green blobs. They'll give me a pow of color for a short time in the spring, and then I'll have lovely foliage for the rest of the season. I'll never have to think about that bed again. Which in hindsight was ambitious, because this is the north side of the house, and peonies like the sun. So the official expectation was lovely foliage, probably no flowers. And honestly, that seemed fair. For 4 years, that's exactly what they gave me. Leaves. Nice leaves. Perfectly respectable green shrub behavior. Now, in fairness to the peonies, I do need to confess something. These peonies were planted too deep. I did not know about crown depth when I planted them. I found that out later after I'd tucked them firmly into the ground like I was putting them to bed for a long winter's nap. And I was reassured that they would correct themselves eventually. They would sort themselves out, get bigger and bushier, and maybe one day bloom. Except they did not. For 4 years, these peonies looked exactly like they did the day I brought them home from the greenhouse. Same size, same attitude, same general air of disappointment. So between the north-facing bed, the zombie weed, the awkward street view, and the possible crown depth crime, I decided it was time. Operation Rehome was underway. 3 peonies were moved from the north bed to the east beds, 3 days earlier. And as Harley is my witness, there were no buds. Not on the ones I moved, not on the ones I left behind, nothing. No floral ambition whatsoever. Then I came back out here, looked at the remaining peonies, and suddenly they had buds. Flower buds. Multiple flower buds. After 4 years. 3 days after I started moving them. And not only did they have buds, they had grown a foot taller, a foot wider, and were standing there like they had been productive members of society this whole time. Which raises 2 possibilities. Either they finally corrected themselves after 4 years, or they heard me say, pack your bags, and immediately entered survival mode. So the plan changed, because sometimes a plant gives you new information, and sometimes that information is, I live here now. We decided the peonies could stay, because obviously with buds, it was no longer safe to move them. We had a vision of turning that whole side into hostas and more hostas and maybe some larger rock features, perhaps some succulents popped into spaces between the rocks. So that was the vision. Hostas, more hostas, a few larger rocks, maybe some little succulents tucked into spaces between the rocks. Very calm, very green, I definitely planned this and did not simply surrender to shade. But then the peonies staged their protest. And once there are buds on a peony, it is no longer safe to move it. Not emotionally, not spiritually, possibly not legally. So the hosta rock succulent plan had to change. The peonies were staying. Which meant this was no longer just going to be a shade bed. It was now a shade bed with squatters. Persistent, dramatic, bud-producing squatters. But regardless of the revised plan, the first job was still the same: clean up the bed. Before anything could happen, the zombie weed had to go. The old debris had to go. The awkward little bits of mystery green had to go. We needed working room. And at the same time, another project was happening in the background, because we already had a successful hosta bed. Ironically, one of the very few projects from Remake I that actually worked was the hosta bed. It worked beautifully. The hostas settled in, multiplied, and became the zebra mussels of the plant world. But now, close to a decade later, that bed has to move. Not because it failed, because we are good neighbors. Buddy next door needs foundation work done, and in order for that work to happen, they need space, which means our hosta bed is in the way. So as inconvenient as that sounds, it also kind of worked out perfectly. We needed hostas, we had hostas, therefore we were moving hostas. Dig, transport, replant. Simple. Except, of course, the peonies had changed the scale of the problem. If they were staying, we needed plants big enough to hold their own around them. So off to the greenhouse I went for ferns. Big, soft, shady ferns that could compete with the peonies and make that whole bed feel intentional. And while I was there, I discovered 2 dangerous words. Hosta sale. Huge hostas. Beautiful hostas. Hostas with leaves the size of salad plates. And they were on sale for very few clamshells. At that point, it was not shopping. It was destiny. So I came home with 4 ferns, multiple large hostas, and still had an entire existing hosta bed that needed to be moved. Which meant the dreaming part was officially over. It was time to get to work. And work I did. First, I brought the new plants over still in their pots and placed them where I thought they might go. And then I stood back and looked. Then the neighbor across the street came over and looked. Then the neighbor down the road came over and joined us. And we all looked. And I'll tell you what, this bed had suddenly acquired a board of directors, and the meeting had been called to order. Once the positions were determined, it was over to the existing hosta bed for the first volunteers. I started at the end, where tiny hostas keep magically popping up, and I cleaned it right out. No hosta was left behind. 3 tubs of hostas later, I was back at the new bed questioning the wisdom of no hosta left behind. But here we were. We were determined, and we were planting, and planting, and planting, and then we were out of room. And I still had a tub and a half of hosta to go. By then, I was done. I was on hour 7 of this day, and I was officially over it. So the last of the hostas went into straight rows like corn. Does it look stupid? You bet it does. But here's the justification. Those tiny hostas will eventually grow bigger, and once they are a decent size, I can move them into better spaces. In the meantime, we are calling that new spot the nursery bed and pretending we meant to do that. Because at Wonky Cottage, sometimes design is intentional. And sometimes, design is what happens when you're tired, muddy, and still holding a tub of hosta. So finally, after hours of digging, hauling, planting, questioning decisions, and pretending the nursery bed was intentional, the hostas were in place. The north side was starting to look like a bed again. Not finished, not perfect, but no longer abandoned city lock chic. And at this point, a reasonable person might have stopped. But apparently, I had not been a reasonable person all day, so why start now? Because while we were at the greenhouse getting ferns and accidentally discovering the hosta sale, we also stopped by the hospital rack. You know, the hospital rack. The place where damaged plants go and wait hopefully for a tender-hearted gardener to come along and say, "Oh no, I can save you." It's my favorite rack. And there it was. A pot of purple flowering plants. At least 3 or 4 different kinds. No idea what they were. No tag that was going to explain this situation in any meaningful way. But they were pretty. And they were in a planter that had originally been selling for $50. Unfortunately, the plastic pot had a huge split down the side, so the whole thing had been marked down to $5. $5. At that point, it did not matter what the plants were. This was not a purchase, it was a rescue mission. So into the cart it went. So after the north bed was done, I turned my attention to the cracked pot of purple mystery flowers. Gingerly removed the plants from the damaged planter. And by gingerly, I mean I dumped them out. And then I carefully teased the roots apart. And by carefully teased, I mean I took a bread knife and I cut the entire root mass into manageable chunks. Was this delicate? No. Was it horticulturally elegant? Absolutely not. But did it work? We are choosing to believe yes. That one damaged $5 planter became 3 hanging baskets. 3 from a cracked pot on the hospital rack. And honestly, that is one of my favorite parts of gardening. Not everything has to start as the perfect plant in the perfect container with the perfect plan. Sometimes you find something broken, drag it home, divide it with kitchen cutlery, and give it another chance. Which, now that I think about it, is basically the entire theme of Wonky Cottage Remake II. At this point in the day, you would think we were done. The peonies had lived, the zombie weed had been defeated, or at least temporarily inconvenienced, the hostas had been moved, the ferns were in, the nursery bed had been invented, the hospital rack flowers had been rescued, divided with a bread knife, and turned into 3 hanging baskets. So naturally, I put away my tools, came inside, had a nice cup of tea, enjoyed a completely uneventful evening, and went to bed for a good night's sleep. The end. Anyway, that is not what happened. Because when I got home from the greenhouse, I discovered that 10 begonias in the coolest colors I had ever seen had somehow snuck into the back of the Jeep. I do not know how this happens. One minute you are buying responsible plants for a specific project, and the next minute there are begonias in the vehicle acting like they've always lived there. And obviously, once a plant has hitchhiked home with you, you have a responsibility. So the begonias needed somewhere to go. The corner bed was currently home to toddler-sized sunflowers, the odd lily that had somehow survived the great pruning, and a coleus. No explanation required for the coleus. So naturally, that seemed like the perfect place for 10 hitchhiking begonias. And 18 Dusty Miller, which also just showed up. At this point, I was not so much gardening as managing a witness protection program for plants with unclear origins. But the corner lot had space, and the begonias had color, the Dusty Miller had contrast, and I had apparently lost all ability to say, "No, that is enough for one day." So into the corner bed they went. Because at Wonky Cottage, sometimes the plan is carefully designed. Sometimes the plan changes because peonies stage a protest. And sometimes the plan is whatever crawled out of the back of the Jeep and demanded housing. Through all of that, the north side finally started to make sense. Is it finished? Absolutely not. Is it perfect? Please, we do not use that language here. But it is cleaner, fuller, more intentional, and already miles better than the abandoned city lot look we started with. And honestly, that is the whole point of Wonky Cottage Remake II. Not perfect, not instant, not always sensible, but moving forward. One bed, one rescue plant, one questionable greenhouse decision at a time. And I learned that when a garden changes the plan, sometimes the best thing you can do is stop arguing and start digging.